In this video, we're going to go over the number input box. So once again, we are using the input element, but this time we are setting the type to number, and that will give us a number input box. So let's go ahead and hit refresh here. And there you can see we've got our number input box. Now what this web control does is it only allows the user to input numbers. So no characters or anything like that. You can only use numbers. So we can enter a very, very large number in here if we want. And you will also notice that this number input box has an up and down arrow, so we can adjust it accordingly. Now what if you want to specify a range in terms of numbers? That is, you will only allow a certain range between a minimum number and a maximum number that can be inputted into this field. And that's where the minimum and maximum attributes come into play. So we'll go back over here to our HTML, and I'll just copy and paste this in here. So again, we're using the minimum attribute and the maximum attribute. And we're going to set this to 0, and we're going to set this to 20. Well, let's bump that up a little bit. Let's set that to 50. So the only numbers now that the user can enter are a number between 0 and 50. That's all that will be allowed. So let's save here. Now, you'll notice when I hit refresh, this box will get much smaller because we're only allowing up to 50 to be entered. So I'll hit refresh, and there you can see we have a much smaller box. And if we start using our up arrow here, you'll see that we're going, and we're going, and we're going. And if we get to 50, it stops. We can't put in anything else. Okay, so that's the number input box. I will see you guys in the next video. In this video, we're going to go over the checkbox. Now, the checkbox is similar to what we did in the last video, the radio button. The only difference is you get to select multiple boxes at the same time. Now, you will remember in the last video with the radio button, we only get to select one option. So that's the big difference between checkboxes and radio buttons. So we're using the input element tag again. We're setting the type to checkbox. We're not going to worry about name because once again that has to do with the server-side code, which we'll deal with in future videos. Once again, we don't have to close out the input element tag, so we can put the label right after this angle bracket. So the four options we're going to allow the user to select are football, basketball, baseball, and hockey. So let's go ahead and refresh this, and you can see we've got our four options here. And notice we can select whatever we want. So once again, this is very different than the radio button. Now, what if you want to force one of these options to always be selected? Well, we can use the checked attribute. So let's say we want football to always be selected. So we come in here and we type in checked, that's the attribute, equals, and we'll just say checked again. And let's go ahead and save this. Let's refresh this. And now you see this is automatically selected. Now the user can deselect this if they want, but the first time the page loads, it will be automatically selected. Okay, that's going to do it for this video. See you guys in the next video. In this video, we're going to continue on with HTML forms, and we're going to look at radio buttons. Now, radio buttons are those small circular buttons that you see on websites, and they are used to take surveys or to ask the user their preference for a particular subject. Now, the key to radio buttons is you only want the user to be able to select one choice. That's all they get with a radio button. They get one choice. Now in this video, we're just going to set up a simple yes or no choice. And those will be displayed as radio buttons that they can select. So you can see we've set up our labels here, and we're just using normal text. We use the input element this time, and we set the type to radio. So this is the type that we use for radio buttons. And you will remember in previous videos that we set this type to different settings if we want a different form. So for instance, for the one-line text box, we set this to text. But for radio buttons, it is radio. Now the name has to be the same for all of our radio buttons because these are all considered one question. So to tie them together, you have to use the same name. If you use a different name here, you will be able to select all the radio buttons. And we don't want that. We only want them to be able to select one radio button. Now the value we're not going to worry about. That's what actually gets submitted to the server, and we'll deal with that in a future video when we talk about server-side code. But just know the value actually is sent as the answer. So for instance, if I answered yes to this question, this is what would be sent to the server where it would be processed. And again, we'll talk about that in a future video. So let's go ahead and refresh our page, and there you see we have our two radio buttons, and we can only select one of them. Now watch what happens when we put in a different name here. I'll show you this. And we'll refresh the page, and now you see I can select both of these. And again, that's why these names have to match. If they don't, then you will be able to select both radio buttons. And again, that's not what we want. We only want to be able to select one. So the two key things to think about here, again, it is some sort of preference or question or survey that you're asking the user, and again, they only get one choice. Now, what if you want the user to be able to select multiple items? Well, that's where a checkbox comes into play, and we will talk about the checkbox in the next video. See you guys then. In the last few videos, we've looked at a single line text box. In this video, we're going to look at a multi-line text box. Now, you would think that we would use the input element tag like we did in the last few videos, but for some reason they decided to give the multi-line text box its own tag, and the element tag that we use is text area. So I'll copy and paste what I've already typed out, and here you see the text area element tag, and unlike the input element tag, we need to actually close this out. And then there are two main attributes, the rows attribute and the columns attribute. And so this is very simple. If you want to increase the size of this text box, you just add more rows or add more columns, but we're just going to use 10 and 40. So let's go ahead and see what we got, and there you can see we have our text box. And let me just type a bunch of stuff in here. And I'll hit return. Let's just type a bunch of text. And I want to show you that the browser will actually automatically put a scroll bar in here for us. So that's pretty nice. So let's hit refresh here and clear that. And like I said, we can increase the size of this. So let's make this 30 rows, and we'll make our multi-line text box 80 columns. And so let's go ahead and refresh. And there you can see we have a much larger text box. Now, if you want to add a label, you can, and we don't necessarily have to use the input label. You can just use simple text if you want. So we'll type in comments. So this is some sort of comments or feedback box, and let's add a break tag. And we'll refresh this, and you can see now we have a nice little comments label above our box. Now, what if you want a submit button to allow the user to submit all the text they have just written out? Well, this is where it gets a little strange. We get to use the input element tag again. And so here you can see what I've copied and pasted in here. So we're using the input element tag. And again, I don't understand why they had to make the text area input tag different, but they decided to. And here we're just changing the type to submit. That's what will give us a submit button. So if you remember, in the single line text box, we had text here, and that made it a single line text box. Here we just have to put in submit, and we'll get a submit button. The value controls the text of the button. So appropriately, we're going to call it submit, but you could change this to whatever you want. So let's go ahead and refresh our page. And there you can see now we have a nice submit button that the user can click on when they want to submit their feedback. Okay, that's going to do it for this video. I will see you guys in the next video. So we talked about in the last video the form element tag, which is right here. And this again just acts as a container to put in whatever input fields we want. And the input field we made in the last video, of course, was this one-line text box, which is formed by the input element tag and also declaring the type as text. And that gives us, again, this one-line text box. But now we want to actually add some labels to these text boxes because people need to know what information they're entering. And so let's say we needed a first name and a last name. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to create our first label for this first text box, and we're going to ask for the first name. So I'm just going to go ahead and copy and paste what I already typed out, and I'll explain it. So here's the label element. That's how we declare a label. And notice we have to close this one out, so we close that out with a closing label tag. The for, I'll explain this in a second. And here is where we put in our text, first name. And this is what will be displayed on the page. Now we have to tie this label to this input element, and we do that with this for attribute. And you can give this any name you want. We called it first name. And then we have to create another attribute in our input element. And that is, again, ID. So we type in ID and then equals and then first name. And so again, this name right here has to match this for attributes. The for attribute has to match the ID attribute. and that's what ties these two together. So let's go ahead and refresh our web page, and there you can see we've got our first name label right here. What's really neat about this too is when you use this label element and you click on the text, let's do that, and we click on the text, you can see the control is automatically highlighted if we click on the text. Now if this was just normal text, it wouldn't highlight this one-line text box. So that's what's kind of cool about using this label element. And so let's just go ahead and copy and paste this code for our second box here, and we'll just rename this to second name. Or actually, you know what, more appropriately we'll call it last name, because that's what it's going to be. And then let's take this ID here, and we'll just copy and paste this right here. And again, this ties our label to our input element, and we'll call this last name. And so let's go ahead and refresh everything up here. And, well, we forgot to actually make the text last name, so let's do that really quick. And we'll refresh this again. And there you see, we've got two text boxes now with labels in which we can collect information from our user. This will be submitted to a server where we will process that data. And again, if we click on the text, it highlights the text box. It's really kind of a nice attribute about this label element. Okay, so that's going to do it for this video. In the next video, we'll actually do a multi-line text box. See you guys then.